afternoon. We are starting this second panel of the afternoon now. It's corruption and reform in the Global South. I would like to welcome to the panel my colleague Raquel Pimenta. She is a visiting researcher at the Georgetown University Law Center in the United States. She was a Fulbright visiting researcher at Yale Law School. She holds a PhD and a master's in economic law from the University of São Paulo, as well as a bachelor degree from the same institution. Her interests include corruption, regulation of monopolies, and public-private relations. With Raquel today at the panel, we have Andreoni to my left. Antonio is a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS, University of London, and research director of the Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Consortium, funded by the Department of International Development, DFID, of the United Kingdom. In 2017, Antonio was appointed Visitor Associated Professor of the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg. Before joining SOAS, Antonio was a postdoctoral research associated at the Institute of Manufacturing, Department of Engineering, University of Cambridge. He holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is a life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. And to my right, further right at the table, we have Catherine Greene. Just a second. And Catherine is here. The country manager for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI. Her expertise is in anti-money laundering, asset disclosure, and transparency in the extractive sector. She has vast experience in anti-corruption, management of conflicts of interest, and beneficial ownership transparency. She has been a consultant for the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and U4. Catherine holds an LLB from the University of San Andreas and an LLM from Yale Law School. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for you at the audience today. We are a bit short on time, so we try to skip straight to the 15-minute slot we have to allow a few questions at the end. We're starting with Catherine, if you could please give me 15 minutes.
Sure. Hi. There. Okay. Hi, hello to everyone, and thank you especially to the organizers for the invitation. It's really an honor to be joining this event. So, as explained in the abstract that I sent, I will focus my presentation on beneficial ownership transparency used as a tool for fighting corruption. Basically, beneficial ownership is not a particularly new topic, but it's a topic that gained a lot of momentum in the anti-corruption agenda in the last decade. What we talk when we talk about beneficial ownership is the person who stands behind any legal structure, any corporate vehicle, trust, or any legal person designed by law. Is the definition itself has several caveats, as we will see in advance. But this is the general accepted notion that is a person who stands behind one or many more corporate veils. It's always a flesh and bone human being, and can many times be the same as a legal owner, but not necessarily. So beneficial ownership has become a big topic lately since the breakout of some scandals related to corruption and tax evasion that were unveiled by investigative journalism. The most famous ones were the Panama Papers that came out in 2016, followed by the Paradise Papers, and very recent, less than 10 days ago, the Mauritius leaks, which put the focus on how these corporate vehicles can be misused to hide the identity of the beneficial owners, and hence hide money and used for illegal purposes. The companies, the trusted foundations, especially when they are incorporated in secrecy jurisdictions that have secrecy laws, can offer a very convenient vehicle for converting the proceeds of crime and tax evasion. And so these scandals have already put the spotlight on the topic that was already being debated in the anti-corruption agenda from the multilateral organizations and other national forums. So the idea of the beneficial owner in of itself is not an issue, and this is something that has to be highlighted. Usually when I go into talking, or anyone goes talking to beneficial ownership, we always think there's something sketchy about it. But the original idea when this instrument was created by the legal framework was to separate, basically give a way to separating the person from the natural person from the legal person, and it was a normal instrument that tried at least to solve some challenges posed by modern economies with the intention of reducing transactional cost, separating the property, creating some way of limiting liabilities. The problem arises, as we've seen before, when this instrument, and usually not only one layer but in many layers, or with a combination of different jurisdictions, the combination of different legal arrangements, is misused to create this anonymity, to make it harder to trace certain assets, to see that taxes are being paid in the jurisdictions that ought to be paid, and basically to enable wrongdoers to hide behind this chain of bails, of legal bails. So again, it's not my presentation and my paper, and generally in the anti-corruption international agenda, it's not that the aim is to eliminate the idea of a beneficial owner. It's just to create transparency around it and put the information out there, so the anti-corruption agencies, other enforcement institutions, as well as the public, can actually know who is the people that stand behind these vehicles. So why can preventing the misuse of legal vehicles be a mechanism for fighting corruption? Basically, it's not going to be a magical solution, but it provides more information that makes it easier, for example, in cases of once bribery is committed or other types of corruption, that you can trace more easily these assets. The beneficial ownership transparency has been already gained a lot of relevance in certain soft law standards and international recommendations. Mostly it became a big deal in the Financial Action Task Force 40 recommendations, which is this sort of like the Bible in anti-money laundering. The FATF is the main body. It's hosted by the OECD, but more than 150 countries applied to it, and it has two main recommendations, the 24th and 25th, that says that jurisdictions need to keep some sort of registry of who are the beneficial owners. For example, when any legal person, any corporation opens a bank account, the bank should know who are the people standing behind it, because that's the only way in which you can eventually cross-check the information and know, for example, where the money is coming from, etc. The G20 and the G8 have also presented some principles, which again are just recommendations. They don't have any binding effect, but add to this momentum of aim, like working for beneficial ownership transparency. So has the EU with their fourth anti-money laundering directive, and now next year it's coming into force. They require all the EU members to have a BO registry, so registering who are the people standing behind the corporate vehicles. That will come mandatory next year for all the members. The EITI, that's where I work at, is a standard who is what countries apply voluntarily, and has in one of its requirements also the requisite to have a registry of beneficial owners, and it's the only standard so far that also requires publicity, not only to have it but to make it accessible to the public, which makes it also not only to the public but to other agencies, for example, facilitating interjurisdictional anti-corruption investigations. And then the Global Forum for Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes from the OECD has a similar provision that actually just draws on the FATF definition. So so far, beneficial ownership transparency has been seen as a tool for enhancing accountability. The definition is one of the issues that has created a lot of debate. Because basically every time you go to any of these international forums, they almost repeat as a mantra this, like, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and it's because it's a very context-dependent concept. And at the same time, the definition has to be very much tailored to the legal framework of a jurisdiction to make sure that actually it works there. It cannot be just copy and pasted for international standards. It should also be addressing how, like, the structures in the market. So if it's like one way of defining, for example, beneficial ownership is if we think who owns or control a company could be defining a threshold. And if that threshold is very high and anyone who doesn't, I don't know, have shares over 30 or 40% cannot be qualified as a beneficial owner. And then we see that the companies that operate in that country have like a very low percentage in the shareholders, then no one is going to be qualified as such, and then you're not going to get any information. It's not going to be useful. So again, it needs to be tailored to the local legal framework and to the international standards, and above all, it needs to be taking almost like a risk-based approach to trying to set in motion something that would work in practice, and not just be like, it's a check, oh, I have a registry, but you know, according to my definition, there's only one person in the whole jurisdiction that qualifies as a beneficial owner, and that's his information and nothing else. So as I was saying, there are certain elements that are essential to the concept. Here, copy some of the definitions from this international principles and standards. The idea is always, by definition, and no matter which how the country would define it, the beneficial owner has to be a person. It cannot be any sort of legal instrument. And the idea is that to go beyond what the statutes of the corporation might say, or the shares or whatever, and see who is actually exerting the control or who's benefiting. Like who is, I don't know, if a luxury apartment in New York is owned by a limited liability corporation, who is actually taking advantage of using that property. Oh, this is out of, I don't know what happened there. So several countries, there's a question on how to identify the BO. One way is to go into companies' registries and look into the information. The problem there is usually you just register the legal owner, but not necessarily the beneficial owner. Another way is try to cross it over also with the information you might have available in your asset disclosure system from the public officials, from the tax agencies, or have specific requirements for public procurement or specific areas like natural resources to disclose this. So some countries have gone into creating like a registry, or at least planning on creating a registry of beneficial owners specifically. The issue with this, when you disclose BO, is that you have some sort of challenges that you face. One of them is interagency coordination. So to make sure, for example, that the information that is disclosed is actually accurate, is updated, is that people are not just lying, it will be very useful to be able to cross it with tax agency information, or again, the public disclosure of public officials. Then you might also have technology challenges if you do this disclosure on paper base, or if you need some, like, to make it more usable, it's better to have it on a electronic base, but then there are some jurisdictions that are not don't have the resources for that. Then the other question is if you want to have public availability of not of information. If you have it publicly available, it is it enhances the accountability that the information can create, but at the same time it raises some privacy and security concerns, and then you have to draw the line on which information you disclose to the public and which not, and how do you decide that. And so this has proven to be a multi-stage process. You have to have initially the commitment from government to move forward to this, and usually this is sometimes very much funneled by civil societies organizations as well. Then you have to take into consideration legal and policy aspects, and then how you're going to actually implement it, how you're going to make the data available, if you're going to create a register or not, and how you're going to manage that. One thing that has been very interesting, initially there was a lot of resistance from the private sector, and that has been shifting, especially by international corporations, because many of these corporations now have due diligence requirements due to where they have their main offices, and these due diligence requirements can be fulfilled more easily if the other countries where they operate have the beneficial owner information available. So basically, in the paper that I'm working on, I'm looking at these jurisdictions because I'm trying to take an approach from the global south. Some countries have, like the Kyrgyz Republic has taken a passed a law requiring beneficial ownership disclosure for specific sectors, mostly for natural resources. Argentina, for example, has only in one jurisdiction in the city of Buenos Aires required the beneficial owner disclosure, but then it becomes the issue of federal design because there are other 23 provinces that are required, so how do you manage that? Ghana has done it only for the hydrocarbon sector, but it has been very effective in the last 2 years since it has been implemented. And so basically these are the case studies that I will draw on for my research. This is how my research, that's what I said in the abstract, will be organized, and mainly the case studies on how the regulations on biotransparency have been implemented will try to draw on which have been the main challenges, which have been the best practices, and mostly how can this tool be incorporated into the broader anti-corruption policy of a country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm now passing the word to Antonio, who is going to provide the second presentation of this panel.
Okay. Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks so much. I'm learning so much in this half a day, and I'm sure many of us are pretty tired, but I'll try to, in 15 minutes, to squeeze. The first part of my presentation is going to be about a specific research program which involves 15 partners around countries and works across 3 countries, Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Nigeria, which is the Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. And the second part is going to be very much trying to reflect upon some of the insights that come out from specific sectoral work done across these countries. We have more than 30 sectors involved, and try to reflect upon how this research on corruption debunk a number of myths around what corruption is and how it operates, especially in countries which are still trying to reach a sort of level of productive transformation and economic development. My title is A Structural Analysis of Corruption, and I'll explain what I mean with structural in that sense. And the second part is really what I'm going to discuss later, which is the problem around the feasibility of institutional reforms in the context of developing countries. This morning I was pleased to see that there was some reference to the debate around institutionalism and institutional political economy, new institutional economics, and how these things have been evolving over time. I don't have time to go through all of it again, but I think it's important to understand how there has been interesting developments recently. So we are all familiar with, of course, the classical Douglas North's rules of the game, and Diogo this morning was referring to some of these debate. And of course, the fact that institutional political economy has always been pointing out how the market itself is an institution. The fact that institutions develop historical and context-specific and context-dependent, again, is an element which goes back to Weber Commons, the old institutional school, up to the institutional political economy. More interesting, more recently, we have been seeing that even the World Bank has realized that they need to figure out how institutional forms and function are different things, and how that allow us to actually understand, give some concrete meaning to the expression that institutions matter and there is no fits-for-all solutions. What I find interesting is that if we look at the last debate in new institutional economics, there has been an increasing interest in factoring in power and conflict and violence. So think about Violence and Social Order by North, Vegas, Wallace, and others has been very much trying to bring in these extra dimensions, so the dimension of contestation and power. And the ongoing political sector, again, you're using the framework that Mushtar Khan developed over 20 years, doing research exactly on informality, corruption, and so on across developing countries. So this is an important dimension, because I think if we want to start engaging with the problem of corruption, we cannot do that simply from a formal point of view. And in fact, when we look at developing countries, we are talking about institutions which are operating in an informal economic environment where lots of transaction deals and corruptive practices are very much pervasive. Now, in this type of context, how do we define corruption? Well, we know that there are lots of ways of parameters that people try to use, and there is this sort of perception-based indicators. It's very difficult to come out with something which we can really trust. But fundamentally, the reason I wanted to put this picture on is because it shows that there is a fundamental relationship here to unpack when you look at corruption as part of an institutional political economy analysis, which is the relationship between corruption and development. So in other terms, is corruption the cause of development? If we remove corruption, we are going to develop, or the other way around. In fact, if we develop, corruption is going to decrease. So the causality relationship between the two has been a critical dimension in the definition of what corruption is and how it works in developing countries. In general, when we look at corruption, we think about corruption as the violation and weak enforcement of rule of law and formal institution, and we know that this is not something that characterizes only today developing countries, but also characterizes all countries at their stage of economic development. Right? So if I go back to my own country, Italy, in a specific phase of structural transformation, the country was characterized by that. And we also know, and increasingly there is evidence, I'll show you in a minute one slide on that, that the way in which this violation of and weak enforcement of rule of law and formal institution has been approached has been mainly building on the idea that corruption is the cause of underdevelopment, so the causality direction going in that way, and therefore that we need to introduce a number of institutions which actually attack corruption. And these institutions generally are about police enforcement, reforms, judicial system, parliamentary reforms, and so on. Now, this is what we call vertical enforcement, so attempt to try to create institutions from the top which are trying to reduce corruption in the bottom. The reality is that the result of this type of policies and institutions are quite mixed and in fact quite disappointing across countries. I don't have time to go through all this, but basically, fundamentally, you see that in this matrix that summarizes lots of the evidence collected over several years, the impact of intervention in terms of the effectiveness and in terms of the strength of the evidence of these institutions is pretty limited. So in other terms, we have seen a number of vertical enforcement that have been put in place, but when we look at developing countries, they don't seem to deliver in a sustainable way, in sustained form, the type of result in terms of both reduction of corruption and increasing development. So both in terms of institutional forms and formal functioning and development outcome, this is actually a quite disappointing result. Yeah, the argument that we build up our research agenda was very much the fact that we need to understand why is that this vertical enforcement doesn't work and how we can complement this type of institutions with other type of institutions, and how, as a result of that, we can better understand how corruption works in different sectors of the economy. And I think I'll go very quickly here. The main answer to this issue is that the vertical type of enforcement of anti-corruption strategy is attacking more the manifestation of corruption more than the structural reasons that are actually leading to these forms of corruption. I will explain what I mean with that. And one of the characteristics of the structural reason is the fact that we are talking about informal economies. And the informality of the economies also means that it's very difficult not simply to have a system which follows the rule of law, but also avoid situation of rule by law, which is what you find in many authoritarian regimes where actually the rule is used in order to enforce specific type of interest. The way in which we have been trying to talk about making anti-corruption real is really saying we can actually improve the effectiveness of some of the institutions, both in their forms and function, if the effective vertical enforcement of rules is combined with effective horizontal enforcement. And what we mean with that is a situation where the actors themselves in a specific sectors are supporting a certain type of rule of law incrementally because they themselves can benefit out of that configuration of rules. And they are able to pay for the enforcement horizontally of this type of rules and isolate those organizations and individuals who are not actually following the rules. If you think about a typical developed economy's corruption is quite low. It's not that the police is all the time checking everything. The same businesses will report if someone is not following the rules because in their interest, they don't want to have unfair competition, or if they want to sign a contract, they need to have a contract with a company that is able to actually follow and demonstrate to follow certain type of rules. So the problem is that in developing countries, you have very few players that are willing to enforce horizontally rules. So you have very few organizations who are actually making money and generating resources out of following formal rules. Actually, they have a system of informal rules which allow them to operate, and to the extent that you try to enforce on them formal rules, they actually all react negatively towards that, because it's not in their region. They are not able, if you want, in a Schumanian sense, there is no exit option from that way of making money. They actually are bound to that system. Now, the way in which we are looking at this issue is actually to say, now, how do we look at these institutional arrangements that allow for a combination of vertical and horizontal enforcement? And we look at these three countries which are very different, but at the same time have a number of similarities. And what we have been trying to do is to identify in each of these sectors what are the type of feasible intervention that we can put in place in terms of anti-corruption reform, and the feasibility is assessed exactly looking at where there are areas in which the current configuration of interest of the players who are working in a certain sectors can actually be leveraged to have some form of horizontal enforcement of rules. Now, doing lots of these case studies, we started learning lots of things about how corruption actually manifests in these countries. And what I'm going to share in the second part of the presentation is a number of things that come out from these analysis and this sector-specific work. And also, this will allow me to explain better what I mean as corruption as a structural problem, and also will allow me to understand and explain better why is that many government institutions are actually take so much time to actually remove corruption within their own functioning, and why corruption is so sticky in developing countries. And here I would like to point out that there is a mechanism in place which actually we tend to misunderstand or not fully capture, which actually is responsible for this stickiness, these extremely difficulties in institutional change, institutional reforms in developing countries. So the very last part of my presentation, I will cover that one. Now, the first thing that comes out from taking an approach to corruption which looks at horizontal enforcement is actually realizing how the fundamental heterogeneous nature of corruption. So corruption manifests in different forms and includes rule violation, misuse of political economic power for private benefits. But the reality is that in each sector of the economy, exactly because you have different forms of organized power, so you have different organizations, you have different individuals, agents, which have different capacity to leverage power and organize power, they actually will use rules and incentives in very different forms. Right? So you have a sector where there is a high level of concentration of power, and many of these developing countries are exactly like that, where few business players can actually control the entire development process of that sector. Let me just give you an example. When you look at Tanzania, for example, smuggling of specific type of commodities is controlled by 2-3 players. And these commodities are critical in the political cycle. Things like sugar, rice, and so on and so forth. If that specific sector has that level of concentration, means that if we want to do anti-corruption reform, we need to start from understanding how trade regulations are put in place, how scarcity is artificially created so that the government can actually issue a food security statement, which then trigger a law process which actually give an import license to these 3-4 players, which can then actually import, by the way, from Brazil, lots of sugar, and as a result of that, can actually leverage resources, capture the rents, and distribute a part of this money to the political constituency, which is going to use that for the political process. And of course, if you think about how an health sector works or education works, it's a completely different dynamic, right? So you think about vocational education training. Why is that all the vocational education institutions are basically privatized? So there are people who are actually charging illegally a number of extra fees to people who want to study or companies who want to train their workers. Is a completely different story from what is happening in, let's say, procurement in the pharma industry or procurement in the energy sector and so on. And this is really about the organized power distribution and the enforceability of rules. For example, in Tanzania, these are the sectors they work on, and for each of these sectors, we identify a combination of different anti-corruption strategies which actually are built on the understanding of the economic structure and the distribution of power among the different players. The second thing that comes quite clearly in our analysis is that very often there are not just situations of corruption as a violation of rule, but in fact, ex ante there are forms of corruption in the process of design of rules. So very often, we tend to take the law as something neutral or something that has been defined in a certain way, but in fact, in many of these countries, laws have been designed in a loose enough way so that actually or powerful organizations, the powerful, can make use of them in such a way that legally they can extract resources out of the country. And this is another big problem, because if we don't look at the fundamental implication in terms of rents allocation of each of these policies, each policy allocate rents to different groups, right? Define who is going to win, who is going to lose. If we don't understand that, then we are unable to understand who is benefiting and how that affects the enforcement. A third point that I would like to make, which is also controversial, is that there is lots of corruption or anti-corruption. So the anti-corruption narrative is now used as a way to actually fight a political game. In many of these countries, actually lots of authoritarian regimes which came out using the anti-corruption flag are actually using that to reduce contestation and political conflict. And the same anti-corruption authority that are set up in many of these countries are actually the first places where corruption is happening, right? So there is a fundamental, again, reducing this sort of myth that you introduce an anti-corruption authority, and this is isolated from the legal system, from the configuration of power, and is going to address the problems that are there. Fourth point, and I'll really stop there, conclude there, is that there has been a dominant approach to corruption, and connected to this narrative in developing countries, which corruption fundamentally is a cultural problem, a behavioral problem. You change, the question becomes how you change people's behavior. Now, if you spend enough time in some of these countries, you realize it is not a matter of changing people's behavior, it's a matter of changing the economic structure and the broader social legal structure, which define a set of incentives which makes people behaving exactly in the most, I don't like the word rational, but the optimizing way to actually survive in that environment. And so in this sense, corruption is intertwined with a specific type of economic structure. So let me give you an example related to that, exactly in the context of people working in legal institution and government. If you think about a certain type of underdeveloped economic structure, which is characterized by scarcity, is characterized by lack of productivity, lack of productive organizations, so lack of competition, contestation. Generally, this type of structure create specific set of behavioral incentives and frame people's motivation and understanding of how they can survive in a certain environment. And people, as a result of that, will start developing a number of capabilities which allow them to operate in this environment. So the idea that actually we need to improve capability in the government because this is going to resolve corruption, that is a capability problem. I remember being in a workshop and saying, if we bring here the most sophisticated, are we going to solve the problem? And everyone was laughing because everyone is aware of the fact that the people are there extremely skillful, but they have a different type of skills. They develop an informal capability which allow them to operate in a system which actually now even make use of the anti-corruption narrative, exactly to maintain the same system in place. And this is a critical dimension because if we want to revert this vicious circle, we need to understand how this can be done. And I think here, and I'll have to go quickly, I think here the traditional economic approach to focus on incentive is important to the extent that we understand how incentives structure an economic system, a social system, a legal system, but also need to understand the extent to which it's possible to start introducing sort of pockets of productivity in the economy, which actually show that alternative way of setting incentives, developing capabilities are possible, and as a result of that, changing the perception and the framing of the corruption problem in some of these countries. So many of our work at the micro level, literally micro level, within each sector, are about changing small ways in which at the moment incentive works and trying to see if it is possible to leverage some of these incremental steps towards more effective anti-corruption reforms. And this is something that takes time, but as we know, I mean, someone says, the first 500 years are the difficult one, and then things go smoothly. These countries need to reach a level of development in the sense of a level of development in which there is contestation around power and there is more distributed power and there are more productive organizations which can start making the enforcement of horizontal enforcement of rules more effective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio. We don't have
I had some technical difficulties with my PowerPoint today, and I won't present one. But I just heard during lunch by two very respected professors that it's even harder to do without PowerPoint. So let's try. So it's basically a consensus that for the last 30 years, anti-corruption policies have undergone a complete overhaul. It became a priority in the international agenda as well as a hot topic in domestic politics. And a number of institutions and instruments, some of them that we discussed here today, were designed and implemented globally, from single anti-corruption agencies to corporate liability rules. However, the centrality of anti-corruption efforts in the international setting and in the national public agenda frequently meets ineffective or disappointing results. As Johnston said, 2 generations of activism and research in support of corruption control have produced indifferent results at best. So maybe if you take indexes, although they are perception indexes throughout the world, maybe 20 countries have moved from a direction of more perception of corruption to less. And there is strong evidence, there is not a lot of strong evidence on the effectiveness of donors' interventions to reducing corruption, as the slide of Professor Antonio just said. So in light of that, there is an urge within the corruption field of reforming the reforms. But what exactly needs to change remains an open question. Scholars and practitioners from different backgrounds have posed different questions to this puzzle, and mostly those questions come outside from the legal field. So today I'm going to talk about 3 contestations to the corruption field that comes from within anti-corruption. One is the question if there is a misfit between the theory that informs corruption and whatever happens in reality to the majority of the countries. Second is the question of the scope of the anti-corruption policies. Is it too narrow or is it too all-encompassing? And third, is it a problem of how to bring about and sustain long and lasting transformations in a given political and economic environment? That is, how does institutional change happens within when you're looking to corruption, or is it a combination of those and others, of course? So what I will try to do in this paper is to use those 3 topics of contestation, of debate, basically the theory, the scope of the anti-corruption policies, and the ways institution change, to analyze the current state of the Brazilian anti-corruption policy. And I have to say those approaches are not compatible between themselves or thought out collectively by their proponents. They operate in different levels of abstraction as well as applying different methods. But, however, more than one use of an instrument or another, they share those 3 features, share the potential of being key components for shaping anti-corruption policies, its conception and implementation. So, first, the theory. Since the 90s, corruption studies have been largely shaped by the principal-agent framework and the analysis of its incentives. So the most important definition of corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gains. So the abuse of entrusted power sustained the idea that corruption is a deviation by an agent of the principal's will or the principal's wishes. So over time, instruments were to create and increase the control of the principal over the agent, restrict discretion, and change agents' incentives. All of this is tailored to this dual theory of principal agents. However, more recently, Some authors have begun collectively challenging how fitting this theory is to localities that face systemic or endemic corruption. Corruption for them is a collective action problem. Individuals within a given society, they share expectations on the behaviors of others, and that creates an equilibrium that is hard to break. In that case, there is no virtuous principle that can monitor a given agent. Even if there was a virtuous principle, the cost of breaking the equilibrium in the long term is too high and will most likely top the benefits. Therefore, shaping individual incentives will do little to change the overall equilibrium of a given society. However, how to shift a given equilibrium to another is not fully answered by the theory. In fact, some of its proponents even said, well, if we don't have an answer of how to shift the equilibrium, we might as well do anti-corruption as control, because once we change this equilibrium towards a more controlled situation, then those instruments will be effective. But that doesn't really solve the problem they were actually pointing. So, in parallel to questions on the theory of corruption and the very fundamentals of how to model and how we think about it, there are discussions more on the policy level. And the efforts that have been concentrated in increasing control and in promoting institutions to do so have, as Professor Andreoni said, mixed results. And first, from the idea of fighting corruption as fighting corruption, in the early 2000s we go for the idea from fighting corruption to a good governance agenda. That is, Kaufman says, attempts to fight corruption have never succeeded when they are narrowly focused on traditional initiatives, such as yet another unenforced anti-corruption law or one more anti-corruption campaign or agency. But that is not the only strand or part of the field pushing the scope of anti-corruption policy and widening the scope of anti-corruption policy. Now we have scholars also talking about how anti-corruption policy is linked to the very idea of impartiality, and that opens a whole other set of instruments. Or scholars now saying that anti-corruption efforts should be about effective government and not governance, and that also opens up the question of what means effective government, and in those terms. So against the idea of fighting corruption by fighting corruption, or even against the idea of good governance, there is the lingering idea of an integrated approach that involves increasing transparency, promoting accountability, meritocracy, and political reforms. All of this becomes part of the anti-corruption agenda. The insight seems reasonable, but how far should it go? If everything is part of anti-corruption policies, do they become a long checklist of institutional normals, and ultimately an unattainable goal? In other words, the expansion of what should be part of the anti-corruption policy carries within itself the risk of becoming a conflation of the problem. And in that sense, one professor says holistic approaches might not mean significant approaches. Notwithstanding the challenges to the theory and the scope of anti-corruption policy, there's also the question of how exactly changes actually happen on the ground. Traditionally, the failure of specific instruments were considered a problem of implementation, and implementation frequently is associated with the lack of political will. This has been the talk for the anti-corruption field for the last decades. However, political will is a catch-all expression that still needs to be further unpacked. More recently, and in connection to a larger institutionalist agenda, sustainable transformation has been linked to debates of how institutions change, and this of course includes questions of how to frame political will, but also debates on incrementalism versus big bang approaches to reform and implementation. While incrementalists' proponents underline the importance of learning, accumulating knowledge, and finding points of entry or even bottlenecks to reform, Big Bang proponents, or even indirect Big Bang proponents, tend to focus on shifting a given equilibrium, assuming small changes would only feed into the same problematic context. As stated before, these debates are not settled, but they show how the anti-corruption field is in between this effort to reinvent itself. And here I think that those three approaches to the theory, to the scope, and to the paths of institutional change may shed light to anti-corruption policies' gaps, failures, and successes. And the contrary can also be true. The experiences on the ground can inform and shape those debates. And finally, in the second part of this work, which is very much on the way, I would like to debate the features of the Brazilian anti-corruption policy. It is true that ever since its return to democracy, Brazil has established what has been dubbed as the web of accountability, that includes components such as audit courts, the public prosecution office, the judiciary, and a myriad of agencies in different branches of power, as controllerships, ombudsmen, inspections, and transparency requirements in general. However, this is just part of the story. Since 2014, the country has been engulfed by its largest anti-corruption investigation ever, Lava Jato. And the idea here is to analyze how this, for the last 5 years, this specific context meets the overall, the general analysis of the web of accountability, that is, how the anti-corruption policy is shaped in the country. And my first hypothesis here is that Lava Jato has consolidated the policy focus in Brazil on control, especially through criminal law. All major reforms, even in, not only we're talking about investigations, but all major reforms during the Lava Jato years have sought to increase control and reduce discretion, often through exactly the instruments of criminal law. Many of them didn't see the light of day, and many of the challenges faced by investigations are in part of the result of accumulating reforms that were not thought through in a systematic fashion. The framing of corruption in Brazil, I would argue, it's become as a systemic problem, that we're trying to fight through a mechanism that is criminal law that can only change if it can change incentives, so individual conducts. So this seems to be in some sort of contradiction to the larger movement in the anti-corruption field. And I'll stop there for my time, and I have some hypothesis of why the Brazilian anti-corruption policy seems to be moving in the direction of more control and more criminal law, and not towards those other highlighted debates. I would say at least two factors seem to be at play. First, how international programs and donors have pushed reforms that are majorly criminal law or control reforms, such as corporate liability. And second, that the strengthening of control institutions in Brazil have created for themselves the power of advocate even more power for those areas, such as criminal law and such as control, and neglecting other measures, or other preventive measures, or other regulatory measures. And so I'll stop those very initial ideas or very initial thoughts right there, and I would love to hear your comments on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Thank you very much for all the panelists for sticking to the given time. And we are going to open the floor for questions. In the interest of time, there are two rules. The first rule is only 3 questions from the audience, and think about good questions. And the second rule is that I'm going to enforce the Twitter rule. So you have to stick your questions to 280 characters, no more than that. No threads, please, okay? 3 questions, go.
The authoritarian shift.
Yes.
Okay, Jed will have first question. If you could speak louder so the microphone can get you.
So the question for Catherine. So I teach trust, and I become very dubious about the asserted benefits of asset partitioning and sort of the separation of beneficial and legal ownership. And so I often hear theoretical models where people explain why this is beneficial, but in your work when people sort of get to the regulation, do people actually have empirical studies that show that having different forms or a variety of forms of separating beneficial and legal ownership actually have payoffs, or is it always just asserting it as like a theoretical possibility? Because beyond disclosure, since I like hard regulation, right, I'm always liking to ban certain types of forms. Like I think franchising, right, should be banned. There's all sorts of legal forms that I just think don't actually lead to the positive benefits, and they have all these negative benefits. So in your work, like how much do the actual empirical studies of asset partitioning come to justify the continued use of all of these different forms? I don't know how many better.
Coutinho?
I have a question for Antonio. You closed your presentation by saying that if these countries have more diverse economies in the future, they might be able to grow out of corruption. I'm simplifying, of course, but I'm wondering how you think about this in the context of our global geopolitical economy, because it's not really clear that these countries have an option to grow out of the current predicaments they're in.
Leslie?
Okay, so to anyone or all of you who would care to answer this, 25 words or less, what is the definition of corruption that you like the best in the end?
Should we start with Antonio?
As you wish.
Very simple question. Thanks. I mean, if we say that we want to rebuild an understanding of law and development, and we want to use classical political economy and classical development economies, which have contributed dramatically in understanding what it is, we know that structural transformation is not something about just economic growth, right? Coutinho would say that, you know, when you have structural transformation, a certain type of ideology, certain type of way of structuring the family, certain type of way of organizing production will not persist, and you will emerge. So in that sense, I think it's a structuralist problem. So if we want to deliver development in these countries, there is no other way. Also because there is no country who managed to have that type of social, institutional, legal, and so on transformation without that, right? So that is the starting point, and this is why our approach is not, as you realize from the selection of sectors, is actually identifying sectors which are critical at early stages of industrialization. Vocational training, land reform, health, and management of incentive for export promotion, and so on. So all this is basically, I think, the key issue that we cannot, we cannot avoid. Now, how do you do it in the context of the current global trade wars and, I would say, jealousy around who is controlling trade and who is controlling manufacturing and so on, which is, by the way, a very old topic. David Hume talked about jealousy of trade a long time ago. So it's a recurrent story around what is power, what is the generation of value, and how value is distributed in an economy and across economy in the world. I think the problem becomes how you design industrial policy and how you design legal instruments which allow to enforce industrial policy in a way that can deliver in a number of areas the type of structural transformation that we need. And we wrote just some work with Coutinho and others on what is feasible in the current global environment in terms of rules, and it seems that actually there is quite a lot of policy space, and sometimes it's the internal political economy of a country which reduces the capacity of that government to use the policy space that is globally available. So I think there has been a problem also in terms of framing that. Of course there is constraint, and of course global corporations are pushing to a certain type of legal reforms around the world, and you think about the TRIPS and all the legal apparatus that are there, TRIPS and so on. But fundamentally the bottom line is that if a government at the regional level, or I'm thinking about the East African Community, SADC, or all sort of association of this type, and at the national level have a right configuration of power that can actually enforce lots of policies, and actually other countries would find very difficult to stop them from doing that. So I think we need to move beyond that sort of element that can become an excuse for not actually implementing policies, and actually given access to governments which don't want to make these reforms, despite the fact that they talk about these reforms. I think I gave in my slide one. I think it depends very much on, choosing the word. It's really that issue around, do we take a culturalist, do we take a behavioral, do we take a legal, do we take an institution? So from my point of view is the fact that emphasized rule of law, formal institute, the formal dimension is critical, because if you define corruption as violation of formal rules, you are admitting the fact that there are a number of informal rules that might be actually corruption as well, but in that country are not defined as a corruption. So there is a problem of what is the formality and informality in the definition of corruption.
I'll take another round of the definition of corruption. I would say that is a starting point for many of the interesting topics. What is democracy? What is authoritarianism? So I guess corruption goes into this the same category that you have several definitions. One goes from the legal, you can go from the legal code and see what's corruption there. That solves only so much. There is one definition more as corruption as exclusion or as a double exclusion, which I find interesting when you're thinking about the relationship between corruption and democracy. But there's also an infinite amount. There's also Lessig's definition on corruption is if an institution is deviated from its initial purposes. And he's looking basically, he's talking basically about legal corruption, basically about lobbying in the American democracy. That's his definition of institutional corruption. So it's a vast field. I think there's lots of disagreement about definition, and that certainly is a problem to especially do interdisciplinary work.
So I'm going to go first to Deb's question. To answer shortly, no. I haven't seen any empirical studies to show what is the benefit of separating this beneficial and legal owner. It's something that from the practitioner side, we always kind of try to contestate whenever we're from the other side, they're pushing backwards and no transparency and no disclosing this information. And the usual arguments well, we needed, some jurisdictions needed to attract investment and so on and so forth, but we haven't seen any, this in my experience, I haven't seen any empirical studies. There has been some, at least there has been some push to what you were saying, you want more concrete rules into, for example, pushing for banning bearer shares, which is I cannot see any argument for keeping them. And I think all these scandals, again, that show the misuse of legal vehicles point into this. There's not, I still don't see, or the literature has not provided a reason why we should keep doing it. I think still underneath it all, at least with beneficial ownership stuff, I think it's a matter of leveling the play field, and then you have the difference between jurisdictions and how they frame this, and it's a very hard question to, again, the no one size fits all solution. But
do we have a go into the definition of corruption?
Into the definition of corruption? From our experience in the organization in EITI where I work on, we've been actually trying to address this, trying to understand also organization like ours, what's our role, what can we do? We don't have any enforcement, but at the same time we don't have, we're pushing a certain agenda. And I think it's also, aside from what Antonio and Raquel were saying, is very linked to, from the organizational perspective, what's your theory of change and how can you frame it within there? So it's a much more complex issue that I could answer in Twitter. So.
And if I made a joke, it depends also the language in which you define it, right? Because the same institutional arrangement in Italian sounds corruption, in German doesn't sound like corruption, for some strange reason.
Thank you very much for all the members of the panel. Thank you very much for you in the audience for sticking to us till that late. But I would ask you not to leave because you're having a book launch now, book launch and discussion short after this panel. So there's no break in interest of time again, not because I'm authoritative. And so this is the book. I would like to welcome the members of the book discussion here, and please stay with us for the discussion.